All right, so today I want to talk about these little helpers that I've set up for working with Python virtual environments. So in this directory right here, you can see I've got a .venv directory for a virtual environment. This is typically the name that I give each virtual environment so I know where to find it. And because I consistently use that, I set up some helper tools that will look for this and automatically activate this if it's available in the current directory or in one of the parent directories of the current directory. So first, for comparison, if I were to execute the script in .venv and then the bin directory and the activate.fish, because I'm using the fish shell, that would activate my environment. And you can see I get the little icon on the left here. This is a modification I made to the prompt in the fish shell to tell me that I'm inside of a virtual environment. All right, so now if I were to go up a directory, I'd actually be sitting inside of a different virtual environment. And so I'd need to deactivate the current environment. And then I'd have to go up a directory here and run that activation script where I've got another virtual environment and activate that. That's all a hassle. Instead of doing this manually, if I hop over to my dot files, I'm going to uncomment the code that I commented out just to disable that for the demo there. All right, so first up, I won't run any of this if I'm not in an interactive shell. So if I'm running, for example, from a script, I don't want this. This is just for when I'm interacting with a fish shell. Otherwise, I'll skip it. All right, so down below here, here's the code where I disabled the typical virtual environment prompt so I can add my own little icon to the left of the prompt. And then I'm going to scroll past this first function here. So I've got this function here. This is a fish shell function, and it's defined such that every time this variable here, so on variable, every time the pwd variable changes, this function will be invoked. So every time I change a path, this function will be executed. What does it do? Well, basically, it looks for a virtual environment. And so how does it figure that out? Well, I've got another function up above here that will look for the virtual environment. And the gist of this is I take the path that is passed. I then look and see if inside of that directory, I have either a .venv directory, which is typically all I use these days, or I used to have a convention where I had a .venv local. Don't really recall the reason why I had both of these, but it doesn't hurt anything. Largely, I just focus on this .venv directory. That's what I name my virtual environments. All right, so if it finds a virtual environment, it's going to echo it out to return it, the entire path to it, and then it's going to return 0, indicating success. Otherwise, if it doesn't find a venv in the current directory, it's going to go up a directory, and it's going to look at the parent directory and do the same thing. So it's recursive. And you can see that down below. As long as the current directory is not at the root of the file system, I'll then get the parent directory, and then I'll recursively invoke the same function. So eventually, if I find a venv in a directory above the current directory, I'm going to use that to activate the current virtual environment. So at the end of the day, this function is either going to return true or false, and then a path if it returns true. All right, so once we get back that directory, potentially, I look and see, did the status code indicate a failure to find a directory? If that's the case, I didn't find a virtual environment. And in that case, I could just bail out. But it's also possible I had a virtual environment activated already, so I want to deactivate that. Otherwise, if I find a virtual environment, then I build a path to the script to activate it, that same one that I just ran over on the left. And then I have a few checks in here just to make sure that file actually exists. If it does, then I go ahead and invoke it, just like I did over on the left here. And then if something goes wrong, I just print out activate failed. Very rare for something to go wrong, but it's always possible. So that's the gist of it. Every time I change a directory, I look for a virtual environment. If I find it, I activate it. And if I don't find it, well, I make sure that I don't have any virtual environments left over from a previous directory, so I deactivate it. Now, to better understand how this works, actually, I'm going to come up here. I'm going to modify this function that searches for the virtual environment to print out the current directory it's looking in. And I'll pipe that out to standard error so it doesn't interfere with passing the path back, like right here. So standard out will have the path, standard error will have any of these debug messages. All right, so if I make that change and I open up a new tab here in the command line, you can see right away the current path here in this bootstrap directory, it's searching for a venv, and it already found one. So it stopped at that point in time. If I change into my .files directory, which has a different virtual environment, now you can see it checks the .file directory, and there's one right there. There's that .venv we looked at earlier. So it doesn't have to do anything to look at any parent directories. It just activates it. You can see on the left here, we have that icon automatically now. Maybe I'll show you here. If I go up a couple directories, up 4 directories, you can see now I don't have the icon, which means I'm not inside of a virtual environment, which means I didn't find one in any of the paths above the current directory. And you can see that search here where I'm first looking in west config. That doesn't work, so I look in repos. That doesn't work, so I look in my home directory. That doesn't work, I look in users, and I go all the way to the root of the file system. And then if I change back to the .files directory, it finds it right away. If I go to a subdirectory, for example, the Z shell directory, and maybe come into a subdirectory, you can see now it performs 3 different searches. So first it looks in the current directory, goes up a parent directory, and then it goes up to the .files, and of course it finds it there, and so it activates it. So that's about it. I find this incredibly helpful when it comes to dealing with virtual environments. That way I don't have to think much about where is it at and how do I activate it. This little helper can do all that for me, and I can focus on just using the virtual environment to run my Python code or do whatever else. And if you're not using a fish shell, it's all right. I've got a version of this for Z shell. If you look for auto, venv, and then look for the Z shell version, basically the same thing. It is a bit older version, so it's not as cleaned up, but it does the exact same thing at the end of the day, and most of the code is the same. It's just in Z shell instead of fish.